One of the important tasks that you might find yourself needing to do is to be able to programmatically alter a mesh's texture coordinates. And this is something that Lab is certainly capable of doing, and it makes it simple. So in this tutorial, I wanted to just cover this one basic concept of modifying a texture coordinates part of a polygon mesh. So let me just create a sphere, and I'm going to apply some texture coordinates. Well, I'm going to apply a texture to it because it already has texture coordinates that are generated by 3ds Max. And the reason I want to apply the texture is just to display the texture coordinates in the viewport so we know how they are positioned on the mesh. And I'm just going to set the option to display my map inside the viewport. And the simple texture checker texture is going to show us how the textures are allocated on the mesh right now. So next thing I will do is create a lab modifier, which is a geometry modifier, and I'm going to put it on top of my sphere, and then I'm going to click Edit Plugin to start editing the lab plugin. So the geometry itself I don't want to modify, and I can just wire my mesh input, which is the input for this modifier, directly into its output. So this will not modify the geometry. But you see right now that the texture coordinates have disappeared, and that is because we are just outputting geometry without any additional texture data. To output texture data, we can right-click on the output of the graph and select Add Component Output and select Texture Coordinates. So this port, if we connect a value to it, will accept texture coordinates. And just like we did here, we can do the same thing for the input. So if I click Mesh and select that Mesh Component Input, I have texture coordinates as an option for the component input. As discussed in one of the previous videos, texture coordinates in the lab are treated exactly the same way as normal geometry. So it is also a polygon mesh, just like our original mesh. And the reason for that is because texture coordinates are essentially the same thing as the geometric mesh. So they have a set of faces and they have a set of vertices to which these faces are pointing. The only constraint that we must have is that the number of polygons in our texture coordinate mesh must be the same as the number of polygons in our original mesh. So let me just wire directly the incoming texture coordinates to the output, and if I do that, we can see the same generated coordinates that we had from the beginning, and these are the coordinates generated by this sphere primitive. And this is pretty boring at the moment, but I'm just going to create a new polygon mesh which we will output for our texture coordinates. And I'm going to create a node here to represent our texture coordinate mesh and just connect the vertices and polygons into the new polygon mesh which I'm creating here. And I'm going to wire this polygon mesh to my output texture coordinates. So now what I want to do is multiply this input parameter here by every single texture vertex, thus scaling it. So I will add a multiply alternative node. And into the first input, I will put my vertices, and into the second input, I will put the user input that we have here. And the result is going to be a vector3 array, and I'm going to wire this into the vertices. And as we do that, we can see that the texture coordinates have already disappeared, but the reason for that is because they are all 0, and that's because they're getting multiplied by 0. And if I start scaling this, you can see that now I am able to modify the mesh's texture coordinates. And just like we were able to modify all the other aspects of the mesh in the previous tutorials, we are also able to do the same thing with the texture coordinates, just by editing its mesh exactly the same way we edited the geometry. One thing again to keep in mind is that the number of polygons for the output texture mesh must match the number of polygons for original mesh, or it will not produce the correct result.